If your food photos are lacking depth, the lighting looks really flat, or maybe the image just looks plain boring, or even slightly blurred, then you could be making one of these catastrophic, deadly lighting mistakes. So stay tuned because in this video, I'm going to be sharing the most common lighting mistakes that photographers are making and what you should be doing instead. So let's jump straight in. So the first lighting mistake I commonly see is when photographers use multiple light sources. Now, whether you're using artificial lighting or natural lighting, you can take absolutely stunning images with just one light source, whether that's one window or one flash or one continuous light. Now, this is especially true with artificial lighting where I see complicated sets with multiple light sources. Now, unless you're a pro with artificial lighting, using multiple light sources can actually kill your shadows or give you multiple shadows in different directions, and then you end up with images that look two-dimensional with no depth. Now, for the majority of my work, I actually just use a single light source. And even when it comes to artificial lighting, and I've worked with big clients such as KFC and Subway, I've done restaurant photography work, I've done editorial work with magazines such as Waitrose, and literally with all of these clients, 95% of the time, I've actually just used a single source of artificial light. So whilst it's not impossible to get beautiful looking food images with more than one light source, the likelihood is it's probably unnecessary and can actually work against your photos. Now, you know I love a good example, so let me show you some BTS. Now, this is a live view recording where I'm actually using a continuous light as my main light source. But as you can see, there's several problems going on here. Number one, I have multiple light sources. My windows are actually open, and you can tell that from the different directions of shadows as well as the different color temperatures of light, because my continuous light is a different temperature to the light that's coming in from the window. And they're also in different directions. I also have overhead lights on, so this also adds to the mix when it comes to different color temperatures. Now, when you have multiple light sources, you can see that there's just no depth to the image, and the shadows are actually just washed out and wiped out. So let's start correcting some of this. The first thing I'm going to do is actually block off one of our light sources. So in this case, I actually blocked out my window light so that the only light source I had going on in this image is my continuous light. But we're still not there when it comes to our lighting. So the next thing I'm going to do is turn my overhead lights off. And you can see that immediately that helps to reduce some of the multiple color temperatures that are affecting the image. Plus, having light coming in only from one direction adds so much more depth and contrast and shadows to my images and makes my hero food really stand out. But overall, you can probably see that I do need a lot more light into my image now that I've canceled out the other light sources. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to increase the power output of my continuous light. Now, if you compare this to what I started off with, the current image has a lot more depth when it comes to the lighting and the shadows. And it also looks a lot more three-dimensional and interesting than the original shot with multiple light sources and temperatures. Basically, my image has a whole lot more tonal range and more contrast. And this is the reason why using one light source is my go-to when it comes to lighting. Now, just a moment ago, you saw me increase my light output, which brings me to mistake number 2 when it comes to lighting, and that's not having enough light on your set. So if we go back to this original example, you can see that here's the image where the amount of light wasn't enough. And this is what it's like when your exposure is perfect. And that's a deadly mistake you're making when it comes to your lighting and food photography, not having enough light on your hero subject. Now, this is particularly common when I see people attempting dark, moody photography, and you can check out my tips for dark, moody photography in this video over here. But whenever you're attempting this style of photography, you really want to make sure that your hero subject is properly exposed. It's okay to have the rest of your image quite dark and moody, especially the shadows, the edges, and having a nice vignette around your food, but your hero food needs to stand out and therefore it needs to be well lit and exposed. And this is really easily done by making sure your flags are in the right place and you're correctly manipulating the light. You really don't want to be blocking too much light on your hero food. Okay, let's move on to the third lighting mistake that I see photographers commonly make, and that is photographing too far away from their light source, whether it's a window or an artificial light. Now, a lot of the times I'll see a photographer, they'll set up their set, which is miles away from the artificial light or the window. But if you really want good contrast, good depth, and a 3D effect where your food and your hero subject is really standing out, then try getting as close to your light source as possible and seeing what effect that has on your shadows and your contrast. Now, this relies heavily on your understanding of the inverse square law as well as the relative size of your light source in relation to the size of your food. So basically the distance of your light source from your food as well as the size of your light source, whether that's a window or your modifier. These things are super important when it comes to food photography, and that's something I explain in a lot of detail inside Artificial Lighting Bootcamp. Now at this stage in the video, I also want to add there's actually a time and a place where you do want to photograph a fair distance away from your light source, especially when it comes to certain instances when using artificial lighting. But I'm actually going to leave that for another video. Now, speaking of the inverse square law, another mistake that I often see food photographers make is not really understand the physics of light. Now, before you click out of this video and you think this is going to get super technical, it's not. So stay with me. Now, the great thing about light is whether it's natural or artificial, the laws of physics are exactly the same. Now, whilst most of us get into food photography for the creativity of it, food photography is not only an artistic and creative outlet. You also need to understand how to correctly expose your food, how to direct your light, as well as how to modify your light, and that is where the science part comes in. Now, the great thing is whether you're using natural or artificial light, light is light and it's going to behave the same way. So in order for you to create these beautiful looking light for food photography or any other type of photography, you need to have some basic understanding of how light behaves. So here are a few concepts that you should really familiarize yourself with. We spoke a moment ago about the inverse square law, so that's one of them. Then you have the quality of light, so that's hard light or soft light. Then you need to have some sort of understanding of reflection, which has to do with the angle of incidence and then the angle of reflection. And you need to understand that both in terms of light as well as the angle of your lens and camera. You also need to have some understanding of the direction of light. So where in the frame is your light coming from? Is it backlighting? Is it side lighting? Is it front lighting? And how this is going to affect the texture, the shadows, and the specular highlights. And then finally, light manipulation through either reflection, diffusion, or flagging. Now, these are all concepts that we cover in great depth inside Artificial Lighting Bootcamp, but they're outside the scope of this 10-minute YouTube video. So you need to have a basic understanding of the physics of light. Okay, on to the next mistake that I see so many photographers making in every genre, and that is being scared of shadows and trying to eliminate shadows from their photos. Now, each to their own when it comes to photography, which is a creative subject and is very subjective and depends so much on your own personal preferences. I always like to say there's no right, no wrong, but when it comes to shadows, this is what helps to add contrast, depth, and mood to your photos. This is what helps with the storytelling. This is what's going to take your photo from a two-dimensional subject to a three-dimensional subject. So it's this interplay between light and shadow that helps to evoke certain emotions and feelings in whoever's looking at your photo. So you really need to pay close attention to the direction of your shadows, the depth and amount of your shadows, as well as the length of your shadows. This is really going to go a long way in helping your image not only to stand out, but also to evoke those different emotions. Does somebody feel warm and cozy when they look at it? Do they get this healthy, fresh feeling when they look at your images? Don't be scared of shadows, and don't always fall into this trick of using a large reflector in the opposite side of your main light source to get rid of these beautiful shadows. Okay, another common mistake I see so many photographers making when it comes to lighting is not incorporating artificial light sooner into their food photography workflow. Now, the common excuse I hear is that natural lighting is best when it comes to food photography. Well, at least that was my excuse when I first started. And usually that's an excuse to cover up an underlying problem, which is not knowing how to use artificial lighting. because if you know how to use artificial lighting, your lighting is going to look as natural as possible. So as an example, I want you to take a look at these two images over here, which look very natural, but both were actually taken with artificial lighting. So once you know how to use artificial lighting and manipulate your lights, you can definitely get that natural looking light. Now, it basically boils down to knowing three things. Number one, what equipment you need. Number two, how to set up and use that equipment. And then number three, how to manipulate your light to achieve any look you desire when it comes to artificial lighting. And guess what? That's exactly what I'm teaching in my next masterclass on how you can master artificial lighting for photography in 30 days or less, guaranteed. So if you want to figure out exactly what equipment you need based on your needs as a food photographer, based on your budgets and your goals and your space, and you also want to make sure that your images look as natural as possible so that nobody can even tell you've used artificial lights, then the sign up link to this masterclass is in the description box below. Okay, on to another lighting mistake I see so many food photographers making, and that is using front lighting. Now, where you place your light in relation to your food plays a huge role in how your food is going to look. And the direction of light should be dictated by the story that you want to tell in your photography. The actual food you're photographing in terms of the texture of the food, the transparency of the food, maybe the shape of the food, as well as what other props are in your scene, including what the heights of these props are and the heights of your food as well. So lots to think about there. So the best way for me to really explain front lighting to you is basically show you some images. So here are some raspberries, which is a great subject to shoot to really understand how texture and transparency is affected by direction of light. So I've actually lit these berries from different directions. So we have side light, then we have backlight, and then we have front light. And no matter what stage of food photography you're at, I think it's pretty easy to say that front lighting, when it comes to food photography, does no favors to your food or your final images. And the main reason for this is that when you actually light an object such as food from the front, you're getting rid of any texture that food has. And your shadows are actually falling behind the food, which can make the food look really flat, really unappealing, and, well, just wrong. Now, there are actually times when you may want to use some fill light coming in from the front, such as when you're backlighting, or perhaps when you're lighting something that needs more light at the front, such as burgers. But your key light or your main light source should never be coming from the front of your scene when it comes to food. It works perfectly fine in product, but not food. So if you look at the berries that are lit from the side or the back, you can actually see that the look of the berry completely changes depending on where the light is coming from. When you backlight a subject such as raspberries, which are translucent, the light goes through your subject and you get this very ethereal looking subject. And then when you sidelight the berries, you get a completely different look. There's no right or wrong between the backlight and the sidelight. It's just a matter of preference. So it's really important to think about the direction of your light in relation to your subject, which is again something we explore quite deeply inside Artificial Lighting Bootcamp. Okay, the next mistake I commonly see when it comes to lighting, and this one in particular is with artificial lighting, is not experimenting with different modifiers. Now, when it comes to your lighting, it's not really your light source, which is creating the style of lighting or the mood that you create, but it's actually the modifier you use in front of the light. And what I commonly see is photographers just picking up the nearest softbox, putting that in front of the light and creating an image that's properly exposed and that works. But then they become too reliant on the setup and they don't experiment using different modifiers to shape their light and create different moods. So they're not experimenting with these different moods and evoking different feelings from their images. Now, the size and shape of your modifier has a huge impact on the end result of your photo. So you're missing out on so much creativity and variety in your work if you're using a single modifier or just a single softbox. And in fact, that's also one of the reasons why shifting to artificial light can have such a huge impact on your business, because now you're not just relying on a one-size window. Yes, you can diffuse the window light that's coming through and you can flag it to make it smaller and more moody, but it's so much more difficult to change the size and shape of your window than it is to use a variety of modifiers. Now, when I'm actually shooting food, I actually reverse engineering starting with What mood do I really want to evoke? What mood am I trying to create? What story am I trying to tell? And then this in turn will define what kind of light I want to create, what kind of shadows I want, what kind of contrast I want, what kind of colors will help me to create this mood in the story. And then based on all of this, I then choose the most appropriate modifier to help me achieve this. So always keep this reverse engineering process in mind when you approach a shoot. Now, speaking of different modifiers, I want you to watch this video next, where I actually highlight some of my favorite food photography modifiers that I think every food photographer needs in their kit when it comes to artificial lighting. Not only am I showing you the modifier, but I'm going to show you exactly the type of images these modifiers help me to create. So I'll catch you in that video next.